I can speak Japanese.
The voice of a black woman rang out clear, sharp, and undeniable, freezing the room as if it had been sliced in two by an invisible blade. Crystal glasses trembled, the eyes of two powerful men flickered with sudden unease, and the heavy atmosphere collapsed into a dead stillness. One short sentence was enough to shatter the illusion of power they thought was unshakable. She had no idea that this moment would change her life forever. On one side of the table sat two ruthless executives from the tech industry, men accustomed to swallowing entire companies with a few signatures, poised like predators. Across from them sat Elara Vance, a Japanese-born millionaire who carried herself with an air of mystery and resolve. She did not utter a single word of English. To them, her silence was weakness, and her foreign tongue nothing more than meaningless noise. They believed they held all the power. What they didn't realize was that every smirk, every sneer, every insult was being carefully observed by someone they had never once considered the waitress. The atmosphere inside Aurelia, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was thick enough to cut with the sterling silver knives laid on the table. Everything in the room was designed to dazzle, walls paneled with polished mahogany, a crystal chandelier dripping light like frozen tears, and a vast window overlooking the glowing city lights below. At one side sat Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Innovations. His silver hair perfectly combed his polite smile, never quite reaching his cold blue eyes. Beside him was Marcus Thorne, the younger, sharper vice president of mergers and acquisitions, whose gaze radiated the same hunger for power. They had come to hunt a prize, Vance Robotics, a pioneer in the field of biologically integrated artificial intelligence. Across from them sat Elara Vance, a woman who shattered every expectation. She was past 60, her posture straight as a drawn blade, her silver-streaked hair tied neatly into a low knot. She wore only a dark silk dress with no jewelry save for a single jade ring. Her face was a mask of calm, giving away nothing. Behind her sat David Chen, her young assistant, his composed expression a quiet reflection of his employer's restraint. From the moment she entered, she upended their plans. Instead of the careful accented English, they expected she spoke in resonant Japanese, her voice flowing like a quiet melody, entirely foreign to the men across the table. David quickly translated, "Mrs. Vance is honored to be here and thanks you for your hospitality." Richard smothered his discomfort with a forced laugh. As the first course arrived, seared scallops served with a froth of yuzu, he offered more hollow compliments. David leaned close, listened, and relayed in clipped sentences, "Mrs. Vance understands the potential for cooperation." And so the conversation dragged on like a one-sided tennis match. Richard struggled to maintain civility, while Marcus's patience frayed, treating the exchange like a farce. Marcus leaned toward Richard, muttering under his breath, "She's doing this on purpose, forcing us to beg through that kid." Richard's jaw tightened, though his smile remained. "Patience, Marcus. This is how they do business. It's about hierarchy. $500 million is worth the wait." But when they met Elara's gaze, a shiver passed through both men. She rarely looked at David. Her eyes, dark and penetrating, locked directly on them, as though stripping bare the thoughts they tried hardest to conceal. From time to time, she spoke a phrase in Japanese herself, leaving them fumbling, dependent on David's translation. A casual question about Richard's Caribbean vacation, a sharp remark on Marcus's declining stock details far too personal for comfort. Yet she knew them intimately. While the titans of tech floundered, Chloe, the young black waitress, stood silently at the side, her crisp white apron framing her slim figure. Her watchful eyes took in everything like an invisible camera. It was a habit born not just from grueling shifts at Aurelia, but from a lifetime of survival. The tremor in Marcus's hand as he raised his glass, the hollow curve of Richard's smile, the cutting intensity in Elara's gaze, nothing escaped her attention. To most, Elara was an enigma. To Chloe, she felt strangely familiar. She had grown up in Kyoto for 15 years, the daughter of an American diplomat and scholar. Japanese wasn't just a second language to Chloe, it was the fabric of her childhood. Schoolyards, scraped knees, whispered tears shared with her best friend Aiko. Even now, in noisy New York, she still dreamed in Japanese. So every word that passed Elara's lips carried layers of meaning that David's careful translations could never fully capture. If his words were technical blueprints, hers were living brushstrokes of calligraphy. Elara's remarks were never simple questions. They were veiled warnings. Her observations carried subtle disappointment, like a teacher saddened by a gifted student failing the basics. Marcus, bristling with frustration, lashed out the only way he knew how loud, condescending English, his hands gesturing as if he were speaking to a deaf child. "We are offering you a very good price, lots of money." Chloe flinched. The insult wasn't just crude. It revealed a fatal flaw in their worldview. Elara's eyes flickered not with anger, but with the weary sadness of someone who had seen arrogance of this kind too many times before. David's voice remained mechanical. "Mrs. Vance understands the financial proposal." But what Chloe heard in flawless Japanese was entirely different. "Tell that child that the buzzing of a fly disturbs me less than his shouting." Her pulse raced, her grip on the water carafe nearly slipping. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a shipwreck unfolding before her eyes. While Richard and Marcus congratulated themselves on their supposed dominance, they were blind to the truth every contemptuous word was unraveling their own future. Elara didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence was sharper than any blade exposing their arrogance for what it was. And then Richard, assuming she could never understand, leaned into Marcus and whispered openly about strategies sealing his own fate. "This deal is going nowhere," Richard sneered. "Slash her executive bonuses. She clearly doesn't know how to manage. We'll gut them from the inside and save $20 million right off the top. She'll never even notice the difference." Marcus smirked, his grin knife-like. "Perfect. She's lost in her own world. Whatever that boy translates, she'll believe." At the service door, Chloe stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold steel. Right before her, two of the most powerful men in the city were plotting fraud, using the very language of her childhood as a weapon to turn genius into ignorance. To them, a woman who didn't speak English couldn't possibly understand the complexities of high finance. They saw only her gender, only her foreignness, never her intellect. Yet Chloe, listening, remembered her 15 years in Kyoto. Her father had taught her that in Japanese culture, silence often isn't emptiness. It is respect, reflection, strength. In Elara Vance's eyes, she saw that same lonely resilience, a towering intellect surrounded by men too blind to recognize it. And in that moment, Chloe thought of her own grandmother, dismissed as a fragile widow, when in truth she had been the unshakable pillar of their family. The manager's words still echoed in her head. "You are invisible. Never speak to the guests." It was the iron rule. Breaking it meant losing her job, falling behind on rent, watching her dream of an education collapse. And yet in that instant, Elara whispered softly, almost to herself, "Is there truly no one here who can see me?" Chloe's heart clenched tight. Dreams, money, the future. All of it suddenly felt small compared to the towering injustice unfolding before her. She drew a long breath, pushed the door open, and stepped onto the Persian carpet. The crystal lights washed over her deep brown skin, illuminating the resolve etched into her features. Every step was an act of defiance, every heartbeat a war drum inside her chest. Richard and Marcus were still smirking at one another, oblivious to her presence. David Chen kept his head down, his body caged in helplessness. Only Elara's eyes lifted, first with surprise, then with a quiet expectancy. Chloe stopped, not on the side of power, but beside the woman who had been dismissed. She bowed, not the timid nod of a waitress, but a deep, reverent bow, the kind given to a master or an elder. The gesture sliced through the heavy air like a blade. Richard and Marcus spun around, startled. "What the hell is this?" Marcus barked. But his sneer faltered when Chloe rose, meeting Elara's gaze, and spoke flawless Japanese, her voice steady and clear. "Vance-sama," she began with both respect and strength. Forgive this unforgivable offense. I am nothing but a humble servant, yet to remain silent in the face of such disrespect would stain not only this house, but my own honor. If you allow, I wish to help." The room fell into absolute silence. The two men stared, their mouths gaping as if a chair had suddenly started singing. The girl they had treated like furniture was now tearing down the wall of language that had kept them in control all evening. David Chen's head snapped up, his polished composure gone. But the deepest reaction came from Elara herself. The mask of indifference cracked. In her eyes, a sky of solitude, tears welled. A soft sob escaped, faint but powerful enough to shake the room. It was the sound of a soul finally being heard after years of silence. You understand me," she whispered, her voice trembling yet dignified. Chloe nodded, speaking with a calmness that belied the adrenaline rushing through her. "Yes, Vance-sama. I hear not only your words, but your heart. I grew up in Kyoto." For 10 fleeting seconds, the balance of power in the room reversed completely. Richard and Marcus, once dominant, were now reduced to powerless spectators. "What is she saying?" Richard snapped, suspicion thick in his tone. But Chloe didn't spare him a glance. Her eyes belonged only to Elara. And then Elara made a simple gesture, the empty chair beside her. An invitation, but also a command. David Chen translated in a hoarse, shaken voice. "Mrs. Vance invites this young woman to join the table." Marcus laughed derisively. "Join the table. She's just a waitress." But Richard, who had read the currents of power in countless boardrooms, knew at once the game had changed. Chloe eased into the seat. The crisp, white tablecloth settling across her lap felt surreal, like a dream she had never dared imagine. Yet Arara's gaze, filled with trust, anchored her heart. Richard and Marcus glared, their anger tangled with unease. "I think we deserve an explanation," Richard demanded. Elara spoke briefly, and Chloe turned to them, her voice ringing with clarity. "My name is Chloe. Mrs. Vance wishes me to serve as her translator. She wants you to understand the full context of this meeting." David Chen gave a quiet nod, silently yielding. Elara began not about stocks or numbers, but about that rainy afternoon in Tokyo, 6 months earlier. A black car, a slick road, the piercing screech of tires. When she opened her eyes, the world had blurred into chaos. Chloe became her bridge, carrying not only words, but the buried anguish beneath them. In that gilded room, the story of a human being shattered the illusion of wealth and power. Richard's honeyed apology quickly morphed into a calculated ploy, a letter of goodwill trimming performance clauses so you can focus on recovery. Marcus chimed in with faint concern, draping false warmth over his words. Chloe translated faithfully, but beneath the politeness, she smelled the metallic tang of blood predators circling prey. The room thickened again, every particle strained by the invisible toxin of conditional kindness. She lowered her voice to Elara, her words steady as stone. 6 months ago, you suffered a severe car accident in Tokyo. The traumatic brain injury damaged your language, centers the Broca area, which forms speech, and the Wernicke area, which understands it. Your memory, reasoning, and technical skill remain intact, but you live with a rare, expressive aphasia under stress. Your brain reverts to its first language. English, the language you learned as an adult, becomes like a locked room. The harder you try, the faster the key slips away. Her explanation landed on the polished mahogany table with the weight of river stones. "Then why not go public?" Marcus blurted, his tone more accusatory than compassionate. Arara's eyes sharpened. She spoke a single sentence in Japanese, cold and precise. Chloe carried the blade of her meaning across the table. Dignity does not appear on quarterly reports. Elara refused to be defined by injury, refused to let her life's work be treated as a liability to be discounted. For her, this deal was not just an acquisition, it was legacy. She needed to know that the heirs of her empire possessed character, not just competence, patience and empathy, not just ambition. Tonight she was testing them face to face. Shame should have swept across the table, the slow words, the manipulative terms, the casual cruelty toward a wounded woman. Instead, Richard treated it like new data, a variable to exploit. He leaned in velvet in his voice. We'll take the burden off your shoulders, simplify everything so you can rest easy. Marcus pressed harder. Sign the letter first, we'll handle the details later. Chloe translated, then caught Elara's gesture, a silent signal to review the files. The leather dossier landed on the table with a soft but decisive thump. Chloe, an art student who could recite the names of Renaissance paintings more easily than indemnity or leverage, still opened it, reading each line, slowly translating every clause with clarity. Richard cut in. Section 7B is just standard indemnity, skip it. Marcus chimed in. Clause 12 is only about streamlining staff. They wanted to steer the pace, slicing away the flow of information. But years of late nights editing her father's diplomatic cables had taught Chloe to smell out evasive language. Please, one moment. She turned to Elara and said in formal Japanese, Section 7B is not standard indemnity. The phrase unilateral renegotiation tied to all intellectual property licenses after the merger allows them to transfer or sell the entire core patent portfolio at will. Elara's eyes narrowed slightly. A signal continue. Chloe flipped to Clause 12. This isn't streamlining. It's a non-compete clause written so broadly it not only shackles the core team but also bars you personally from any tech-related work for 10 years. They're not just buying the company, they're trying to buy your future. At that moment, Chloe was no longer just a translator. She was dissecting the text. Each sentence she exposed sent her pulse hammering like war drums. The two men in expensive suits suddenly seemed smaller, their polished smiles reduced to a thin veneer over raw greed. Richard snapped. What are you telling her? Say it's a standard contract. Chloe held his gaze, her voice steady, adopting the cadence of corporate formality. I'm ensuring Mrs. Vance fully understands every provision. For a deal of this magnitude, transparency is foundational. Spoken from the mouth of a waitress, the words made him falter for a beat. Elara's question came lightly, but sharp as a blade. Where is the valuation for the R&D division? The original proposal listed $100 million. The revised draft buried it under aggregate assets. Marcus waved it off, just administrative simplification. The total value is what matters. Chloe delivered Elara's reply verbatim, preserving its weight in man. In my experience, when a number that large suddenly goes silent, it's rarely for administrative reasons. Please point me to the line that records the true value of my life's research. Sweat beaded along Marcus's temple. The shuffle of frantic page-turning filled the room. They found no foothold. Elara sipped her tea, the corner of her mouth curving not in relief, but in recognition that each cut had struck true. Chloe realized then Elara wasn't asking to learn, but to measure. Losing one language didn't strip her of comprehension. It only muted her spoken English. She didn't need someone to interpret the ink on the page. She needed a witness to the essence in the room. The silence, the feigned confusion, it had all been a stress test of character with the highest stakes. Now the final exam had arrived. The atmosphere shifted. Predatory confidence drained, replaced by the metallic tang of panic. Richard and Marcus bent low over the stack of papers, whispering in frantic bursts as their facade of control crumbled. Elara sat tall, her eyes assuming the shade of command. Her Japanese voice, once soft as silk, rang out warm with steel, precise and resonant, the voice of a CEO who had bent an industry of men to her will. Chloe listened, then translated word for word, restoring order to the room. Mrs. Vance appreciates your efforts, but these are the non-negotiables. Restore full valuation of the R&D division as a separate item. Remove the right of unilateral renegotiation of intellectual property. Reduce the non-compete clause to 18 months, applying only to C-level positions. Preserve the current team's performance-based incentives for at least 3 years after the merger. And ensure every so-called turnkey transfer includes a transparent roadmap with quarterly independent audits. Chloe paused, then delivered the final hammerstroke. Fail to meet these conditions, and she will walk away tonight in open bidding with other partners. Honor is the first condition. Price is only the second. The emotional rhythm swelled, then slowed. The room fell silent, broken only by the faint tick of a clock. In Manhattan, in the private dining room of Aurelia, the balance had shifted, not by dazzling numbers, but by dignity rendered in its true voice. Richard glanced from the contract to Elara, then to the young woman in a white apron, the one who had just turned language into a mirror of conscience. Profit could always be negotiated, but this time he understood the woman before him would never sell her legacy cheap, and the waitress at her side would never again be invisible. Chloe drew a steady breath, straightened her back, and lifted her gaze like a curtain falling. She turned to Richard and Marcus. Both fell silent at once, seeing her expression. "Gentlemen," Chloe said, her voice clear and unwavering, "Mrs. Vance has given me her final decision." She let the pause stretch long enough for each man to hear his own heartbeat. First, she looked squarely at Richard regarding the buried intellectual property clause. Mrs. Vance considers it outright theft, an attempt to strip away the core patents, the soul of Vance Robotics. Not only is it a breach of good faith, it is a personal insult. Richard's face drained of color. Second, Chloe continued, turning to Marcus regarding the manipulative non-compete language. Mrs. Vance finds it amusing. She suggests that letting someone who cannot read a balance sheet without leaking numbers presume to dictate her career's future is, her words, the pinnacle of arrogant delusion. Marcus's expression cracked as if slapped in a crowded hall. And third, Chloe lowered her tone, but each word landed like a lock clicking shut regarding the deliberate omission of the R&D valuation. That division is developing Project Chimera, a technology you don't yet understand, with a projected market value far beyond this entire deal. Your attempt to seize it for nothing has been noted. The room plunged into silence. The decisive blow was yet to come. Elara spoke a single short phrase in Japanese. At that moment, David Chen withdrew a slim recorder from his jacket, set it on the table, and pressed play. Richard's voice crackled through the speaker, faint but damning. "Go straight to the final offer. Cut her team's bonuses. Save $20 million? She won't know." Then Marcus's voice followed, laced with disdain. "Perfect. She's lost in her own world." One by one, their whispered greed and contempt filled the room. When the recording stopped, the silence that followed was heavy as a verdict. Richard Sterling's face went ashen. His once dashing silver hair now nothing more than a tired crown. Marcus Thorne stared at the recorder on the table as though it were a coiled snake. And then, the miracle happened. Elara Vance leaned forward, fixing both men with an unblinking gaze. In a voice hoarse from disuse, yet sharp as crystal, she spoke English for the first time that night. "I believe. This negotiation is over." It was like thunder rolling through a cathedral. The locked door in her mind burst open, whether from relief, adrenaline, or sheer willpower. She rose to her feet with regal poise. David pulled back her chair. She inclined her head toward Chloe, an unspoken thank you, a shared victory without words. Then Elara strode out, leaving behind the wreckage of a $500 million deal and 2 careers collapsing into rubble. The soft click of the door closing echoed through Chloe's chest. The once luxurious private dining room felt like a mausoleum. Chloe stood alone amid the cloying scent of roast duck and truffle oil aromas that now seemed gaudy and suffocating. The open briefcases, the fountain pens, the exposed contract lay scattered on the table like tombstones for greed. As the adrenaline drained from her body, shivers set in. She pressed her palm to the polished mahogany chair she had just vacated, still warm, to remind herself it was real. She, a fine art student living on tips and instant noodles, had just shattered the unspoken law of service more spectacularly than she could have imagined. "What have I done?" The service door swung open. Mr. Dubois, the manager, entered like a storm bottled tight. He did not shout. He spoke low, his words sharp as knives. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Chloe straightened her hands, instinctively clasped behind her back in the posture of a server. "Sir, I can explain. Explain what abandoning your station, sitting with guests in a private dinner." Each word struck like a nail sealing her coffin. Richard Sterling's chief of staff is screaming on the phone. They're threatening to sue you and the restaurant for breach of privacy, for unprofessional conduct, for every clause you can imagine. Our reputation is built on discretion and perfection. And you 10 minutes, and you've put it all at risk. You're fired, and I'll make sure no place in this city will hire you to wash dishes. Every word was a hammer blow on the fragile coffin of her New York dream. Tuition was due in 3 weeks. Rent was already late. Her dream of one day becoming a curator, living among art, crumbled into debt notices and eviction threats. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. And then the kitchen door opened again, this time with a quiet click. David Chen stood in the doorway, his calm presence making Dubois' fury look childish. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," David said, his voice low and steady, carrying a cold authority. Miss Chloe did not act on impulse. She acted under the direct and explicit request of Mrs. Elara Vance. Dubois blinked, his attack faltering. "That's impossible, She provided a service neither you nor any guest could provide: clarity and respect." David stepped forward. Dubois instinctively stepped back. "And regarding Mr. Sterling, I suggest caution with threats. We have a complete recording of his whispered intent to manipulate the contract terms. My next call will be to legal." The color drained from Dubois' face. The name Vance was no longer just a line in a reservation ledger. It was the weight of a global empire and an army of lawyers behind it. David turned to Chloe, his stern expression softening into warmth, respect that no paycheck could equal. "Mrs. Vance wishes to see you. She's waiting in the car downstairs. Please come with me." He spoke as one offering honor, then inclined his head politely toward Dubois, ending the matter with finality. Chloe nodded. As she stepped out of the gilded chamber, she knew one truth tonight had not only preserved a legacy from being stolen. It had restored a woman's voice and given Chloe herself the shape of a human being finally seen. Outside on the streets of Manhattan, car lights gleamed against frosted glass. In the back seat of a sleek sedan, Elara Vance was waiting. And the story that had closed inside Aurelia was only the opening chapter of a new journey where dignity was the first condition and price only the second. David gave a slight nod of signal, then turned coldly back to the manager. "See to it that her personal belongings are gathered and delivered to the address I will provide. Miss Chloe will not be returning." He held the door for her, and Chloe walked through, leaving behind Dubois stunned and gasping like a fish stranded on dry land, his authority evaporating into smoke. She did not look back. She walked straight through the bustling main dining room where servers and guests whispered and pointed. In their eyes, Chloe was now a scandal in motion. She untied the white apron, folded it neatly, and laid it on the counter like a ritual farewell to the world she had just dared to upend. Following David out of Aurelia, the cool, damp Manhattan night air rushed against her face, sweeping away the stifling perfume of luxury. At the entrance, a sleek black Rolls-Royce idled softly, its hum like a quiet breath, radiating an aura of cold authority. David opened the rear door. Chloe, her heart racing as though she had stepped into a dream, climbed in. The door shut with a firm, final click, sealing her off from the chaos of the streets. Inside the spacious cabin, the scent of leather mixed with a faint trace of jasmine. The soft lights reflected off her brown skin, and the tight curls framing her head like a halo. Across from her, Elara Vance leaned back in her seat, her face lined with exhaustion after the night's battle of wills. 6 months adrift in the cocoon of silence had drained her, but her eyes shone with deep gratitude. In hesitant but steady English, each word carrying weight, she spoke. "It is a very lonely place, Chloe. For 6 months I drifted in it. People shouted as if I were a fool, or spoke as though I didn't exist. Tonight you gave me my voice back, not just with language, but by hearing the things I never said." Chloe's throat tightened. I thought I'd be fired. I was terrified. But I grew up in Kyoto. Hearing how they spoke to you, the contempt I couldn't stand by." Elara smiled gently. "I know. I saw it in your eyes. When Marcus raged, when Richard whispered his schemes, you reacted. I was watching them, yes, but I was watching you as well." She leaned forward, her voice sharpening. "The accident changed everything. The world only needs to sense weakness once before the sharks circle. My company, my legacy, built over 40 years, suddenly fragile. I must find someone to carry it forward, a partner I can trust. But how do I know their true motives? To most, I am either a victim to pity or an opportunity to exploit. Chloe sat silent, her chest tight as Elara continued. This world is full of Richards and Marcuses, but I need someone rare, someone who sees the unseen. Her gaze was steady, contemplative. This isn't about translating. This is a turning point in your life. I need someone at my side, someone who values integrity above ambition, who can hear not only words, but the rhythm of hearts in a room. I need a mirror for my conscience. Her voice softened, though her eyes burned with fire. I am founding the Vance Foundation for Art and Innovation, investing in young female engineers and artists. That will be my true legacy. I want you to travel with me, to advise me, to be my confidant. She paused, her businesswoman's calculation surfacing. I know you are a student. Your studies will not be interrupted. All tuition, including graduate school anywhere you choose, will be covered. You'll have housing in my building and a salary generous enough that neither you nor your family will ever worry about bills. I'm not offering you a job, Chloe. I'm offering you a life, a launching pad, a chance to place your gift on the world stage. Chloe sat frozen. The cramped apartment, the leaking faucet, the gnawing fear of tuition and overdue bills, all of it dissolved in a few sentences. But this gift was more than money. For a black woman long treated as invisible, it was an invitation to step into the light, a chance to live with purpose, with meaning. Yet fear still rose. Why me? I'm only a waitress, an art student. I'm nobody. Elara laid her hand gently over hers, warm and steady. Never say that. Richard and Marcus are somebodies, with titles, with money, with power. And yet they are blind. They see only spreadsheets. You see people. Tonight you saw me when an entire room chose not to. That is not skill. It is essence. In my world, that is a superpower. I do not need another schemer. I need a pair of eyes that can truly see. Tears welled in Chloe's eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. All those years of living quietly, observing like a shadow, had been training for this single moment. She drew a deep breath, met Elara's gaze, and saw not just a millionaire, but a mentor, a kindred spirit. A door had opened, and deep in her soul, she knew she had to step through. Yes, Chloe whispered. Then louder, her voice firm with fate. Yes, Mrs. Vance, I would be honored. Elara's smile bloomed rare and radiant. Ara, she corrected softly. From now on, call me Ara. As the Rolls-Royce slid through Manhattan traffic, the skyscraper lights glittered like a galaxy fallen to Earth. An hour ago, Chloe had been a speck of invisibility in the city's vastness. Now she felt herself part of that constellation, no longer unseen, but shining. This is not just a story about a deal. It is a story about the masks we wear and the judgments we cast. We look at uniforms, titles, silence, and fill the gaps with bias. But behind every pair of eyes lies a universe. Elara Vance was not a victim. She was a queen testing her court. And Chloe was not just a waitress. She was a black woman whose quiet power had turned an entire room on its axis. If this story reminded you of how often we underestimate the quiet strength of black women and the extraordinary power of compassion, press, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more true stories where unexpected heroes are all around us waiting to be seen. Thank you for listening.